The year was 2847, and humanity had finally earned its place among the stars. A place they had worked hard to achieve over 3 long centuries of proving themselves worthy of Galactic. Trust Admiral Cody Warren stood on the bridge of the Earth, Carrier Resolute Dawn, and watched the blue marble of Kepler 442b grow larger in the viewport. The colony world of New Providence, where 2 million human settlers had built their homes and raised their children, intelligence reports suggested the Vectory Dominion was preparing an assault on the colony, and the Insectoid Empire had been pushing against coalition borders for decades, testing the defenses and probing for weakness wherever they could find it. The Galactic Coalition had welcomed humanity into their fold 300 years ago. A sprawling network of 12 spacefaring species united under treaties of mutual defense and trade. And humans had proven themselves worthy allies time and time again. Their adaptability and fierce loyalty made them invaluable partners in the Coalition's expansion into the Outer Rim territories. And many alien species had come to rely on human soldiers and engineers to help protect their interests. Lieutenant Amy Shaw worked at her station on the bridge, her fingers dancing across the tactical display as she gathered information about their allied forces. She turned to the Admiral with a look of relief on her face and reported that Coalition reinforcements were holding position at the rally point. As planned, the Selvari battle group had arrived along with the Korthan dreadnoughts and the Nethkai support fleet, and all of them were present and accounted for just as the Coalition had promised. Cody allowed himself a moment of relief at this news, because the Coalition had answered humanity's call for help, just as they always had in times of crisis. 12 ships from Earth's own fleet would join forces with 47 allied vessels to defend New Providence from the Vectory threat. And together they would show the Insectoid Empire that attacking human colonies was a mistake. They would regret. The Admiral looked out at the stars and felt confident that this battle would end in victory for the Coalition forces. He turned to his communications officer and ordered him to signal the fleet to begin their approach to defensive positions around the colony world below. What happened next would be burned into human memory for all of eternity. A moment of betrayal so complete that no human would ever forget it. As the human ships moved into their assigned formation and prepared to engage the enemy, the Coalition vessels did not follow them into position. Instead, the Allied ships began to withdraw from the system, their engines flaring bright as they pulled back toward the edge of the solar system. And, away from the coming battle, Cody felt his blood run cold as he watched the tactical display update in real time. Friendly signatures retreating one by one, until only the human vessels remained in defensive positions. Communications Officer Danny Price spoke with a trembling voice and informed the Admiral that they were receiving a transmission from Coalition High Command. The message that came through was brief, and it was devastating beyond anything Cody could have imagined in his worst nightmares. The Galactic Coalition had reached a secret accord with the Vectory Dominion, trading peace and territorial concessions for something the Coalition wanted more than human friendship. In exchange for peace, the Coalition would stand aside and allow the Dominion free reign over all human-occupied space throughout the galaxy. The message explained that humanity had grown too quickly and too ambitiously for the comfort of the other species, and that humans were a destabilizing influence that threatened the delicate balance of galactic power. The betrayal was complete in that single moment, and 300 years of loyalty meant nothing to the aliens who had called themselves friends and allies. 300 years of humans, bleeding and dying alongside their alien partners in countless battles, had been erased by a single diplomatic agreement made in secret. Lieutenant Amy Shaw announced that the Vectory fleet was emerging from hyperspace at the edge of the system, and her voice sounded hollow and distant as she reported the terrible numbers. Over 200 Vectory warships had arrived to destroy New Providence and kill everyone who lived there. Cody watched his former allies vanish into the darkness of space, their ships disappearing one by one as they abandoned humanity to face annihilation alone behind him on the planet below. 2 million innocent souls waited in their homes, completely unaware that the galaxy had just condemned them to death without trial or mercy. The Admiral stood tall despite the rage building in his chest and spoke to his crew with a voice that remained steady. Even as his heart broke, he ordered all hands to battle stations and told them they would hold the line against the enemy no matter what the cost. The Battle of New Providence lasted 6 terrible hours as 12 human vessels fought against more than 200 Vectory warships. The human fleet fought with desperate fury born of betrayal and rage. And their sacrifice was not in vain. They destroyed 47 Vectory ships before the last Earth vessel fell silent and drifted broken in the void. Admiral Cody Warren died on the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, and his final act was to ram his crippled carrier directly into a Dominion command ship, taking hundreds of enemy soldiers with him into death on the surface of New Providence. The colony burned under the bombardment, cities turning to ash and glass as Vectory weapons rained down from orbit. But not everyone died in the attack, because deep in the underground emergency shelters of New Providence, 17,000 survivors huddled together in the darkness. They listened to the thunder of bombardment above their heads and wondered if they would ever see sunlight again. Among the survivors was a young engineer named Laura Bennett, who sat in the cramped shelter holding her dying father's hand as he took his last breaths. He had been wounded in the initial attack, and there was nothing the medical staff could do to save him in the chaos of the shelter. As Laura watched her father die, she made a promise to him, a promise she would spend the rest of her life keeping no matter what it cost her. She swore that humanity would remember what had been done to them on this day, and that humanity would survive no matter what the galaxy threw at them, and one day, when the time was right, humanity would make the entire galaxy answer for the crime of betrayal. The survivors stayed hidden in their shelters for weeks after the bombardment ended, waiting until the Vectory forces finally left the system and moved on to their next target. When they finally emerged into the light, they found their world transformed into a wasteland of craters and ruins. But they were alive, and that was enough to begin again. Laura Bennett stood among the ashes of her home and looked up at the stars that had betrayed her people. She did not weep and she did not scream, because there would be time for grief later. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered, and that was survival. The other survivors gathered around her and looked to her for guidance, because she was one of the few engineers who had made it through the attack. Laura told them they needed to find transportation off this dead world, and they needed to disappear into the darkness between the stars where no one would think to look for them. The galaxy thought humanity was broken and defeated, and they would use that assumption against their enemies. Somewhere out there in the vast emptiness of space, they would find a place to hide and rebuild, and when the time came, they would return to show the galaxy exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge of extinction. The survivors began their long journey into the sifted unknown, carrying nothing but their memories and their rage behind them. New Providence continued to burn, a funeral pyre for the millions who had died trusting in allies who were never really their friends. The betrayal was complete, but the story was far from over. Humanity had been knocked down before, and they had always found a way to stand back up. This time would be no different, except that when humanity rose again, the galaxy would learn to fear the species they had tried to destroy. The decades that followed the betrayal were marked by systematic extinction as the Vectory Dominion swept through human space with cold and methodical precision. Coalition observers watched from a safe distance as colony after colony fell to the insectoid invaders, their ships hovering at the edge of each system to ensure humanity received no help from anyone. The aliens who had once called themselves friends now served as witnesses to genocide, their presence a constant reminder that humanity stood alone against the darkness. Earth itself came under siege in 2851, when the Dominion finally turned its attention to the human homeworld, the planetary defenses held just long enough for evacuation ships to scatter into the void, carrying millions of refugees away from the world where humanity had first crawled out of the oceans and reached for the stars. Those who could not escape were left behind to face the victory, and the ancient cities of Earth burned just as new. Providence had burned before them. By the year 2860, the official galactic records listed humanity as functionally extinct, a footnote in the long history of species that had risen and fallen across the millennia. A few scattered refugees might survive somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Coalition acknowledged in their reports, but they posed no threat to galactic stability. The human experiment had ended in failure, and the galaxy could return to its comfortable equilibrium without the destabilizing influence of those ambitious primates from Earth. The galaxy was completely and utterly wrong in this assumption. In the depths of the Perseus Arm, far from any charted space lanes or inhabited systems, the remnants of humanity found refuge on a rogue planetoid drifting through the endless void. They named this frozen rock Haven, and it became the seed from which their resurrection would eventually grow. Laura Bennett was now in her 40s and served on Haven's governing council. Her hair streaked with gray from the stress of leading her people through the darkest years of their existence. She stood before the assembled survivors in a great cavern they had carved from the ice and stone, her voice echoing off walls that glittered with frozen moisture. Laura told them that the galaxy thought humanity had been destroyed because their worlds had been destroyed. But the aliens had forgotten something important about the human species. Humanity had never needed worlds to survive because they were the species that had endured ice ages with nothing but fire and stone tools. They had survived plagues that killed half their population and wars that threatened to destroy everything they had built. They had crawled out of the mud and reached for the stars with nothing but determination and spite driving them forward. The betrayers had given humanity a gift without knowing it. Lavra explained to the crowd. They had given humans a reason to become something the galaxy never imagined they could be. Silent years began after that speech, and for 150 years humanity existed as ghosts haunting the dark spaces. Between the stars, they built no colonies that could be found and claimed no territory that could be mapped. They sent no signals into the void that could be traced back to their hiding place. They simply watched and waited and worked in the shadows, where no one thought to look for them. Laura Bennett did not live to see her vision fulfilled, but her granddaughter, Kate, carried on the work she had started. Commander Kate Bennett inherited her grandmother's determination and her cold fury that what had been done to their people. By the year 2950, the hidden shipyards of Haven had produced a fleet unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. Human engineers had been freed from the constraints of Coalition design philosophy. During their long exile, they had been driven by the cold fury of betrayal to innovate in ways their former allies could never have imagined. They had revolutionized warfare in ways that would soon become terrifyingly apparent to everyone who had abandoned humanity. The Coalition species had grown complacent in their centuries of peace, their technology stagnating while humanity continued to advance in secret. Their militaries had shrunk to shadows of their former strength because there was no one left to fight. They had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy that had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from vengeance. Kate Bennett stood in the command center of Haven at the age of 42, her grandmother's eyes looking out from her face as she reviewed the final intelligence reports. The galaxy still believed humanity was extinct, and that belief would be their undoing. Coalition trade routes ran unguarded through the darkness because there was no one left to threaten them. Military installations operated with skeleton crews because there were no enemies left to defend against. The Vectory Dominion had integrated into galactic society, and the genocide of humanity was now just A historical footnote that was already fading from the memory of younger generations Commander Paul Grant stood at Kate's side as her most trusted aide and advisor. He reported that all assets had achieved ready status across every deployment zone. They had planned 1,400 vessels were waiting in position across the galaxy, hidden in asteroid fields and behind moons and in the shadows of gas giants. Ground forces were standing by to deploy at a moment's notice. Cyber warfare units had infiltrated every major network in Coalition space and were waiting for the signal to strike. Kate looked at the holographic display showing the galaxy spread out before her like a map of conquest. Thousands of target markers glowed red across Coalition space, each one representing a site that would soon feel the wrath of humanity returned. Every species that had stood by and watched humanity burn had a target on their worlds. Every government that had signed the Accord of Betrayal would pay for their treachery. Every world that had profited from human suffering would learn that some debts could not be escaped. Kate spoke quietly as she contemplated the magnitude of what they were about to do. 150 years of waiting and planning had led to this moment. The galaxy had called humanity extinct and written them out of the history book. She turned to face her staff, men and women who were descended from the survivors of New Providence and Earth and a dozen other murdered colonies. Their eyes held the same cold fire she felt burning in her own heart. Kate gave the order to send the signal and declared that Operation Lazarus was now active. Across the entire galaxy, in perfect synchronization, humanity revealed itself to those who had betrayed them. The ghosts had returned, and they were hungry for justice. Ships that had been hiding for decades activated their engines and began moving toward their target. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives for this moment checked their weapons one final time. Computer specialists watched as their carefully planted viruses began to wake up and spread through alien networks. The silent years were over, and the time for vengeance had finally arrived. Kate watched the first attack reports come in and felt her grandmother's spirit standing beside her. Laura Bennett had promised that humanity would make the galaxy answer for what it had done. Now, her granddaughter was keeping that promise with fire and steel and the fury of a species that had refused to die. Betrayers had forgotten the most important lesson of all. Humanity always remembered, and humanity always paid its debts. The galaxy learned it was not alone in a single devastating hour that would be remembered for thousands of years to come on. The Selvari homeworld of Ketha Prime, the planetary defense grid, went completely dark without any warning. Orbital stations found their computer systems locked behind encryption. They could not break. Their weapons went offline and refused every command to reactivate. Their communications were scrambled into meaningless static that prevented them from calling for helping. The confusion that followed. Nobody saw the human strike fleet emerge from the shadow of their largest moon, where it had been hiding for 3 long weeks. The ships were painted black and ran with minimal power signatures that made them nearly invisible to Selvari sensors. By the time the orbital defenders realized what was happening, it was already far too late to stop it. The bombardment lasted exactly 12 minutes, and when it ended, the Selvari Grand Congress building was nothing but a smoking crater. Every military command center on the planet had been reduced to rubble and ash, but the civilian infrastructure remained completely untouched. The hospitals and schools and homes standing unharmed amid the destruction. This was a deliberate choice that sent a very clear message to everyone watching. This was not extinction coming to repay extinction. This was judgment being delivered with surgical precision. Similar scenes played out across Coalition space as Operation Lazarus unfolded exactly as humanity had planned. Corthan lost their entire home fleet while it sat helpless in space dock amid weapons that Corthan sensors could not detect. Destroyed ship after ship before anyone could respond. The proud warrior race could only watch as their military might was erased in a matter of hours. The Nefkai found their economic networks frozen solid behind encryption that no one could crack. Centuries of accumulated wealth became worthless numbers trapped in computer systems that refused to obey their masters. The merchant species that had grown rich from galactic trade was suddenly poorer than the lowest beggar on their streets. The Vectory Dominion faced the worst punishment of all because they were the ones who had carried out the genocide against humanity. They were the instruments of extinction that the Coalition had unleashed upon innocent human colonies. Now, they would learn what it felt like to have death come knocking at their door. Commander Kate Bennett watched the tactical feeds from the bridge of her flagship, the Prometheus Unbound. The name was a memorial to a ship that had served in the old Earth fleet before the betrayal. Her grandmother Laura had known people who served on that vessel, and none of them had survived the war. Vectory homeworld of Vecthar Prime filled the viewport before her, a pale yellow sphere that was now wreathed in the fires of orbital combat. Human ships danced through the Vectory defensive perimeter, their advanced technology making a mockery of weapons that had not been upgraded in over a century. General Marcus Cole appeared as a holographic image beside Kate and reported that ground forces had secured the primary hive complexes. Resistance was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted because the Vectory could not adapt to human tactics quickly enough. Their warriors were designed to fight in swarms using overwhelming numbers to crush their enemies. They had never faced an opponent that could see them coming and pick them off one by one before they could mass their forces. Human soldiers moved through the Vectory cities like ghosts that struck without warning and vanished without a trace. Their powered armor made them nearly invisible to the compound eyes that the insectoids relied upon. The invaders had become the invaded, and they were finally learning what humanity had felt 150 years ago. Kate gave orders to ensure that civilian casualties remained at the minimum possible level. She reminded her commanders that humanity was not there to commit genocide against the Vectory people. They were there to demonstrate a point that the entire galaxy needed to understand. The point was brutally simple in its elegance. Humanity could have destroyed every species that had betrayed them if they had chosen to do so. They had the weapons and the technology and the cold fury necessary to burn the galaxy clean, everyone who had wronged them. But they were choosing not to do that because they wanted to take something more valuable than alien lives. They wanted to take power away from those who had abused it. Within 6 months of Operation Lazarus, the Galactic Coalition had ceased to exist as a political entity. Human forces occupied every major government facility across all 12 species that had signed the Accord of Betrayal. They controlled every critical communication node that allowed the aliens to coordinate with each other. They held the economic infrastructure of 12 civilizations in an unbreakable grip that could not be loosened. The Coalition fleets that tried to resist the human occupation were destroyed with contemptuous ease. Their outdated weapons were useless against human shields that had been designed specifically to counter them. Their tactics were predictable because human intelligence had been watching them for over a century. Every move the aliens made had been anticipated and countered before they could even give the orders. Kate Bennett stood before the assembled representatives of the former Coalition in the great chamber that had once served as their seat of galactic power. 12 species looked up at a single human woman and saw their own mortality reflected in her cold eyes. She told them that 150 years ago they had made a choice that would define their civilizations. Forever they had chosen to sacrifice humanity for their own comfort and security. They had watched human worlds burn and called it peace. They had erased humanity from their history books and slept soundly in their beds. Kate paused to let the weight of her words settle over the assembly like a shroud. She told them that humanity could kill them all right now. If that was what they wanted, they had the means to destroy every alien world and end every alien life in the galaxy. Some humans believed that was exactly what they should do, Those humans remembered New Providence and the 2 million people who died there. They remembered Earth and the billions who were lost when the homeworld fell. They remembered the silence of coalition ships as Bilvush. They retreated and left humanity to face extinction alone. But humanity would not become the monsters that the coalition had believed them to be. Instead, they were offering the aliens a choice. The same kind of choice that had been denied to humanity. The aliens could submit to human authority and live under human protection going forward, or they could refuse and face the consequences of that refusal. Kate did not need to explain what those consequences would be because everyone in the chamber understood perfectly. The coalition species surrendered within 1 week of that meeting. The galaxy had new masters now, and those masters remembered everything that had been done to them. Humanity had returned from the dead, and they had brought judgment with them. The galaxy expected human rule to be brutal and violent, because that was what they would have done if the situation had been reversed. The alien species prepared themselves for enslavement and systematic oppression at the hands of their new masters. They expected revenge to be extracted in blood across generations, until humanity's thirst for vengeance was finally satisfied. What they received instead was something far more terrifying than anything they had imagined. They received bureaucracy. The human Galactic Authority was established in 2952, and it implemented a system of control so comprehensive that it made the old coalition look like complete anarchy. Every species in the galaxy found itself bound by regulations covering every single aspect of their existence. Trade required human approval and permits that had to be filed in. Triplicate travel between star systems required authorization that could take months or years to obtain. Communication across borders had to be monitored and approved by human oversight committees. Reproduction rates were tracked and managed through careful population control measures. Military development was restricted to levels that humans deemed acceptable. Technological research had to be submitted for review. Before any experiments could begin, nothing happened in the galaxy without a human bureaucrat signing off on it first. Administrator Frank Coleman was appointed as regional governor of the former Corthan territories. He was a patient man with a talent for organization and a deep understanding of how systems could be used to control populations. He gathered the confused alien officials of his region together and explained the philosophy behind human rule. Frank told them that they had believed they understood humanity when they made their decision to betray the species. They had thought humans were simple creatures, driven by emotion and easy to manipulate. They had assumed that a species so young and inexperienced would be easy to discard. When they became inconvenient, they had been completely and utterly wrong about everything. Humanity was the species that had invented contracts and legal systems. They had built empires on paperwork and conquered their own planet through committee meetings and legal precedents. They had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of bureaucratic control over their own populations. Now the aliens would learn what it meant to exist under human administration. The rules that humans imposed were not cruel in any obvious way that the aliens could point to. The regulations did not call for executions or torture, or any of the horrors the aliens had expected. They were simply inescapable in their complexity and scope. A Selvari merchant who wished to transport goods between star systems discovered that they needed permits from 17 different human agencies. Each permit required its own application process with its own fees and waiting periods. By the time all the permits were approved, the trade opportunity had usually passed. A Nethkai scientist hoping to conduct research had to submit proposals that would be reviewed and revised and reviewed again. The approval process could take years or even decades before final authorization was granted. By then, the scientist was often too old to conduct the research they had originally planned. A Vectory hive, seeking to expand its population, required environmental impact studies and resource allocation assessments. These reviews could take so long that entire generations of Vecthory would be born and die before approval came through. Nothing was explicitly forbidden under human rule. Everything was simply made impossibly difficult to accomplish. The former coalition species found themselves completely paralyzed by the weight of human procedure there. Societies ground to a halt, as every decision required approval that never seemed to come. Ships sat in ports for years, waiting for clearance that was always just a few more forms away. Factories stood idle, while applications for operating permits worked their way through endless review processes. Entire generations of aliens grew up never knowing what it meant to make a decision without asking human permission first. Some species adapted to the new reality better than others. The pragmatic Corthan learned to navigate human bureaucracy with something approaching efficiency. They hired specialists whose only job was to fill out forms and track applications through the system. The Silvery used their long lifespans to develop the patience needed to wait out approval processes. A delay of 20 years meant nothing to a species that could live for centuries. The Nefkai, who were masters of economic manipulation, found ways to grease the wheels of administration. They discovered which human officials could be influenced and what resources they valued most. But the Vecthory could not adapt to human rule, no matter how hard they tried. Their hive minds were designed for rapid, collective decision-making that could not function under human oversight. Every choice required consensus among millions of individuals, and consensus required approval from human authorities. Approval required review, and review required time that the hive mind simply could not process. Within 50 years of human rule, the Vecthory dominion had become a shadow of its former terrifying self. Their great hives fell silent one by one as their population declined under the weight of administrative paralysis. The warriors who had once burned human worlds could not fill out the forms required to feed their own larvae. Kate Bennett was now in her 80s and served as B.S. High Administrator of the Human Galactic Authority. She received reports of the Vecthory decline and found that she felt mixed emotions about what was happening. She had dedicated her entire life to making humanity's betrayers pay for their crimes, but watching an entire species slowly suffocate under paperwork brought her no joy or satisfaction. She asked her successor, Director Chris Palmer, if this was really what humanity had wanted to achieve. Was the goal to watch the Vecthory die of boredom rather than bombs? Chris considered the question carefully before giving his answer. He told Kate that humanity had wanted the aliens to understand what had been done to them. They wanted the betrayers to know what it felt like to have their fate controlled by others. They wanted them to experience watching their civilization slip away while being completely powerless to stop it. The Vecthory were learning that lesson now. Whether they survived the education was entirely up to them. Kate nodded slowly and asked about the other species who had merely watched while humanity burned. Chris assured her that they were learning too. Every denied permit taught them a lesson about helplessness. Every delayed application reminded them of their powerlessness. Every form submitted and returned for revision showed them what it meant to have no control over their own future. Humanity had remembered what was done to them. Humanity would always remember. And now the galaxy would never be allowed to forget. By the year 3100, the galaxy had been under human administration for nearly 150 years. The iron grip of the human galactic authority had not loosened during that time. If anything, it had grown tighter as each new generation of human administrators refined their systems of controlled alien species of the former coalition existed in a state of permanent paralysis that showed no signs of ending. Their societies had been frozen in place by regulations they could not navigate, and appeals they could not win. The Selvari, who had once been the most numerous species in the galaxy, had seen their population decline by 40%. Their youth had given up on a future that offered them nothing but paperwork and waiting. Many of them simply stopped having children, because they saw no point in bringing new life into a galaxy where nothing could be. Accomplished, the Korthan, who had once been proud warriors, had been transformed into a species of clerks and bureaucrats. Their entire culture had been reshaped around the single task of processing human paperwork. The great battle songs of their ancestors had been forgotten and replaced with filing systems and organizational charts. The Nethkai had retreated almost entirely into virtual reality worlds of their own creation. They had abandoned the physical universe for digital realms where human regulations held no power over them. Entire generations lived and died without ever experiencing the real galaxy their ancestors had once dominated, and the Vecturi were simply gone. Last Hive had fallen silent in 3078, and their species was now completely extinct. The most feared warriors in galactic history had been defeated not by bombs or soldiers, but by forms and procedures. They had drowned in paperwork while humanity watched and took careful notes. Director Lisa Coleman was the great-granddaughter of Frank Coleman, who had first implemented human bureaucratic control. She now served as the head of the Human Galactic Authority and ruled the galaxy from the administrative center on Earth. The human homeworld had been rebuilt in the centuries since the betrayal, and its cities gleamed with technology developed during the long exile. But Earth was more than just a planet now. It was the capital of an empire that spanned every inhabited star system in the galaxy. Lisa's aide Sam Peters entered her office and reported that the Selvari delegation was requesting an audience. They wished to discuss relaxation of trade restrictions in their home sector. Lisa checked her calendar and found an opening in 4 years. She told Sam to schedule a preliminary hearing for that date, and the Selvari would wait as they always did. Everyone waited for humanity now because there was no other choice, but not everyone in the galaxy was content to wait forever in the outer reaches of human space where the authorities' grip was weakest. Something new was beginning to stir. Intelligence reports filtered back to Earth describing unauthorized gatherings on distant worlds. Alien species were meeting in secret to discuss things that had not been approved for discussion. The coalition species were beginning to remember what they had forgotten during their long subjugation. They were remembering that they had not always been cattle to be managed by human farmers. Lisa read these intelligence reports with a frown creasing her forehead. She observed to Sam that the aliens were finally starting to organize. After all this time, Sam asked if they should increase enforcement in the outer territories to crush the resistance before it could grow. Lisa considered the question carefully before answering. For 150 years, humanity had held the galaxy in a state of total seizure. Every species had been paralyzed by the bureaucratic machinery that humans had wrapped around them. It had been revenge for what was done to humanity during the betrayal, but it had also been security, because a galaxy that could not move could not threaten humanity again. Nothing lasted forever, though, and Lisa understood that truth better than most people. She had studied the histories of countless civilizations and seen the same patterns repeat over and over. The rise and fall of empires followed cycles of oppression and revolution that no species had ever escaped. Humanity had punished the galaxy for its betrayal and made certain that no species would ever forget the price of crossing them. But a punishment without end eventually became indistinguishable from simple tyranny. Lisa made her decision and told Sam to arrange a summit with representatives from all species. It was time to discuss a new arrangement for the galaxy. Sam's eyes went wide with surprise, and he asked if she was really suggesting what he thought she was suggesting. Lisa confirmed that humanity had made its point over the past century and a half. The Yahar-Nahas. The galaxy would never forget what the coalition did to humanity, and they would never forget what humanity did in return. But humans could not hold the entire universe in stasis forever. It was time to see if the aliens had finally learned their lesson. The summit convened on a space station in neutral territory, far from any homeworld representatives from every surviving species. Gathered under human supervision for the first time in over a century, the aliens looked at their human hosts with a mixture of fear and desperate hope in their eyes. They wondered if this meeting meant their long imprisonment was finally coming to an end. Lisa Coleman stood before them looking small and fragile compared to the massive alien forms that filled the chamber. But everyone present knew that this small human woman held more power than all of them combined. She told them that 150 years ago, they had made a choice to betray humanity. They had chosen to watch humans die because it was convenient for their political arrangements. Humanity had survived their betrayal and returned to make them understand the consequences. Aliens had learned what it felt like to have their future stolen from them by forces beyond their control. But humanity had never wanted to be tyrants, ruling over a galaxy of slaves. They had wanted the aliens to remember what they did, and the aliens had remembered that lesson every single day for 150 years. Lisa touched a control on her podium, and the holographic displays around the chamber changed. The red markers showing human control began to fade away one by one. They were replaced by open channels and unlocked systems that the aliens had not seen in generations. Lisa announced that effective immediately, the human Galactic Authority was dissolving its administrative oversight. The former coalition species were free to govern themselves again. They could make their own choices and build their own futures without asking human permission. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the assembly as the aliens struggled to process what they were hearing after so long and so much suffering. The idea of freedom seemed completely impossible. Lisa continued speaking, and her voice hardened as she delivered her final warning. Humanity would remember what happened during the betrayal forever. If any species in the galaxy ever again considered betraying another, they would face human vengeance. If anyone ever again watched while innocents burned and called it peace, they would answer to humanity. The next time there would be no mercy and no second chances. The galaxy had been locked in total seizure for 150 years. Now humanity was loosening its grip on the universe. They were doing this not out of kindness or forgiveness, but out of absolute confidence in their own power. Humanity had proven they could destroy the galaxy if they chose to do so. They had proven they could control it absolutely for as long as they wanted. Now they were proving something even more important. They were showing that humanity could exercise restraint and offer second chances. They were demonstrating that humans could be better than those who had betrayed them. The aliens filed out of the summit in silence as each species processed what had happened in their own ways. Some wept with relief at the end of their long suffering. Others remained skeptical and waited for humanity to change its mind. Few understood the deeper truth behind what had happened. Humanity had not really released the galaxy from control. They had simply changed the nature of that control into something more subtle. From this day forward, the galaxy would police itself. Every species would watch every other species for signs of betrayal. And they would do this because they knew humanity was always watching them, always remembering everything that happened, always ready to remind them of the price of treachery. Lisa Coleman returned to Earth after the summit and stood on the balcony of her office. She watched the sun set over the rebuilt cities that covered the planet where humanity had first evolved. Somewhere out in the distant past, her ancestors had crawled from the mud and reached for the stars. They had been betrayed and nearly destroyed by those they trusted. They had risen from the ashes and seized control of an entire galaxy. And now they had done something even more remarkable than conquest. They had chosen to let go of their grip and trust that the lesson had been learned. That choice was what made humanity different from every other species in the universe. Humans could hold grudges longer than anyone and plan revenge across centuries. They could bring entire civilizations to their knees through bureaucratic determination alone, but they could also forgive when the time was right, or At least they could move forward and give others chance to prove they had changed. The galaxy would never forget the human galactic authority. They would never forget the 150 years of total seizure that had paralyzed their civilizations, and that eternal memory was exactly what humanity had wanted all along. Some lessons needed to be written in ink that would never fade. A way humanity had written their lesson across the stars.